If you're curious about what the day-to-day life in the United States Army could be like, stick around because that's what I'll be explaining. What's up, friends? I am U.S. Army veteran ThatChrisChaos, and in this video I'm explaining a little bit about what it's like in the day-to-day life in the United States Army. Now, there are a lot of factors that can determine how your day is going to go, so this may not be kind of the set standard for everybody in the Army across the board. But hopefully this will give you a good general idea of what kind of the common day-to-day life is like in the Army. Also be aware there are certain jobs that don't even have a very set schedule, such as like MPs. They have to do like shift work. So they're sometimes working nights, sometimes working days, sometimes working weekends and holidays, and it's not, kind of the same as a lot of the other people in the United States Army. So I won't really be getting into the specifics of like MPs and all those other special type of jobs and MOSs, but more of what the common soldier, the everyday soldier, is going through on a day-to-day basis. I'll also be throwing in there some of the kind of alternates of some of the days you may expect where they're longer than others, so the time in the field, deployments, stuff like that as well. So let's start off with the best case scenario, the more common days that you'll have, which is usually a Monday through Friday kind of day. Now it usually starts off with doing physical fitness in the morning. Soldiers will usually have like a 6:30 formation for PT. They'll have to show up pretty early. Usually the common thing in the Army is you have to be 10 or 15 minutes prior to the time you're supposed to be there. So if formation is at 6:30, then you should probably be showing up like 6:20, 6:15. In some cases, even earlier than that, because like for me, I would often have to do like some kind of meetings before the 6:30 formation, and also a lot of people want to beat the traffic because traffic can get really crazy around PT formation time. Now, physical training is Monday through Fridays, but a lot of times on Thursdays, you'll have what's called sergeant's time training, and they'll kind of start off maybe at 6:30. We're doing some kind of road march that leads into training for the day. Physical fitness, or PT, usually lasts until about 7:30, but there are also some cases where units want to extend that a little bit longer and train up until 8. After physical fitness is done, you sometimes will have another formation to kind of release you from PT. Sometimes it's done at the squad level or the platoon level, and sometimes you meet back up as a company to be dismissed from PT. After that, the soldiers will then have from, say, 7:30 or 8 until about 9 or 9:30 before they have to report to work. So during that time frame between reporting back to work, they're doing things like getting a shower in, changing into uniform from the PT uniform to the regular uniform, and also trying to get breakfast. And that could be breakfast at the chow hall, breakfast at a local place, or breakfast at home. Now, typically work call formation is usually at 09 or 9 a.m. Sometimes this is a formation where they have things to put out or just want to get another accountability. And sometimes it's just showing up to where you're supposed to be at 09. So at this point, you're usually doing your job. In some cases, you're doing some training, or you have something that's going on usually during this time frame. Working in the motor pool, working in the shop, working wherever you're supposed to be working, or attending some kind of classes that maybe you're supposed to be doing. That really just kind of depends on what your job is as far as usually what your day-to-day kind of task usually is. For example, like me as an 88 Mike usually meant being in the motor pool, working on your vehicles, maybe doing some missions. For mechanics, it meant working on the vehicles, doing maintenance. And infantry guys are usually just training throughout the day, going through battle drills and doing all sorts of other stuff that they have scheduled. Now, for a common day, usually you can expect lunch to usually be around 11:30. There are some cases where, you're busy and you're doing stuff and you don't get to take lunch until 12. And also some more extreme situations I'll talk about in a little bit though. But commonly, usually lunch is from 11:30 to 1300 or 1 p.m. Soldiers usually get about an hour and a half for lunch. During this time, they're free to go do whatever. They can go to, a fast food place, a restaurant if they have time for it, or even go to the chow hall. In my early Army days, I liked going to the chow hall all the time, and then later I started going out to eat, and then that started getting expensive. So then I started usually making a lunch and then bringing it with me and eating in my car or eating somewheres. So after lunch, you're back to work at 1300 or 1 p.m. Sometimes this can be a formation. Sometimes it gets crazy with some units. Some units are doing a lot of formations throughout the day, but sometimes you're just going back to work at 1300 at 1 and going back to doing whatever you were doing earlier in the day or continuing with something else. Now, commonly the end of the day usually comes about around 16:30 or 4:30. A lot of times that's a formation as well. Maybe it's just at a platoon level, maybe it's at a company level. It just kind of depends sometimes. Usually they put out some information maybe for the next day or whatever they have to put out for information, and then release the soldiers to, be free for the rest of their evening. So from there, soldiers can, go back to their barracks, go home, go out to dinner, whatever they want to do. They kind of have their freedom from here until they have to be back at work for physical fitness or whatever they have scheduled for the very next day. And then, of course, commonly you have weekends off, Saturdays and Sundays, and if there's a holiday somewhere in there, you may have a 3-day weekend or a 4-day weekend. Now, yes, that is kind of the common example of your day, but that's not always what your day is going to be like. There are some other examples where your day may be longer, may start earlier, may be a lot busier, and I'll kind of give you some examples of how some of that can play out. So in some other situations, there may be times where you have to show up to that first formation, maybe at 6:30, maybe even earlier, and you're showing up in uniform. You're not showing up in your physical fitness uniform because you have some kind of mission to take care of, something you have to do early in the morning. So you may be showing up in uniform to that first formation or even earlier and continuing your day all the way through without getting that little bit of a break like some soldiers would get after PT to get breakfast or whatever. Soldiers, if they have this kind of situation, maybe they're rotating through breakfast, maybe they're just going and grabbing a to-go plate from the chow hall, or even maybe not even getting breakfast at all. Maybe they have to just suck it up and just go without. There may also be cases like this with lunch as well, where soldiers are busy working through lunch and maybe they'll rotate through, they'll send a couple people to go grab something to eat and come right back, maybe go to the chow hall, grab a to-go plate and come right back, and then just continue working through lunch so they can get the task done. And this can also happen sometimes at the end of the day. So instead of maybe having a 4:30 formation to, close out the day, you're still continuing to work, and then they'll do kind of a similar thing where maybe they'll send someone to go grab a quick bite to eat and come right back, or go grab a to-go plate and come back and continue working while you're eating. And then that can go up till, who knows what time sometimes. It just really depends on what the mission is that has to get done in that scenario. Now, some of those days aren't like every day. I've had some times where I was in the Army where that would be maybe 2, 3, 4 days in a row, and then the next week would be back to just a normal week. Now, that can vary based on units. It just really depends on the mission that's going on, what's happening, and kind of how that unit is operating. So I know a lot of people will say, oh, I never got off at 4:30, I always did this. But commonly, you're going to get off around 4:30, but there are going to expect some days where you're going to go longer or earlier, or have some really crazy days, maybe for even a week straight. Maybe longer, but your most common days out of the year are going to be that 6:30 in the morning, taking lunch, and then getting off by about 4:35. Now, in another scenario for your day, sometimes you have additional duties. Things like what is called CQ or staff duty. These are duties where you're usually just sitting at a desk, monitoring a building, doing some checkups here and there, and this is usually like a 24-hour shift. It might be something like 07 in the morning until 07 the next day, maybe 08 in the morning to 08 the next day. And you're staying awake for that entire time. It's maybe you and maybe 1 or 2 other individuals that have to pull a shift together. And you're doing things like answering phones and doing checks on, buildings or gates or whatever to make sure they're locked, as well as some other duties that may be, kind of going in with that CQ duty or staff duty. Now, after you pull this 24-hour shift, you're usually getting the next day off. There are some horrible situations where units, still make you work through the day, which is very horrible and not very common. Also, usually with like officers, they are not having to stay there for the whole 24 hours, so they may have to do, so many checks during the night and still have to work the next day. But for the most part, those who are pulling the whole 24 hours, staying at the desk and doing those duties, usually get that rest of that day off. So if you're getting off at, say, 8 o'clock in the morning the next day, then you have the rest of that day off and just report back to work the very next day. And this can take place on weekends as well as holidays. I remember when I was in the Army, a lot of people loved having Thursdays for duty because that meant like something like 08 in the morning on Thursday to 08 on Friday morning, and then having the rest of Friday off. Sure, usually sleeping most of Friday, but it still kind of felt like 2.5-ish days of having off. And I remember the worst day I felt like having was Saturdays, because you would go from all of Saturday into Sunday, and then you slept most of Sunday away, and then back to work on Monday. There's also additional things like maybe units come up on things like red cycle, where you have some kind of detail going on that can also affect your day as well. Sometimes units have things like red cycle where they're doing things like mowing lawns around post or having to do additional duties around post, and those schedules can vary based on whatever the mission is that unit has to do for that week, 2 weeks, whatever the red cycle is lasting. I remember I'd have things like, you'd have to go around post mowing lawns, like around brigade and, around the headquarters buildings. And then other details where you had to work the front gate with the MPs, and that would usually be shift work where it would kind of depend on what shift you got. So those days can really kind of mix things up when that happens as well. Next, let's talk about when a soldier has to go to the field. Often soldiers have to go to do training. Maybe it's for gunnery, maybe it's just some kind of combat training they're doing, maybe it's the National Training Center in Fort Irwin, maybe at Fort Polk for JRTC. There's a lot of combinations of different field problems that a soldier may have to go through to do some training. These training events can last anywhere from maybe a couple of days to like a month. Now usually it doesn't go past a month, because if you go past a month, then the unit has to pay the married soldiers separation pay. So commonly units try not to go past 30 days of consecutive training of being away from home, but there are some cases where it does if it's really needed. Now in the field, you're usually starting off your day pretty early. Units aren't usually doing PT in the mornings, but there are some cases where they do PT in the field, but most commonly I've found they usually don't. It's just getting up really early in the morning and starting doing your missions. It used to be a thing where you got up before the sun rised and go pull guard in what was called stand to. The Army has gotten a little bit away from that. They may still do it in some areas, but it's not a very common thing anymore for the Army to do stand to. But they are usually still waking up pretty early. Maybe it's 5 o'clock in the morning and getting started on missions, and sometimes earlier. Like I said, it usually just depends on what the mission is. But a common morning could be something like 5 o'clock in the morning, maybe 6 o'clock in the morning, just depending on what's going on. Typically in the field, you will usually get a hot breakfast. That also still depends on the mission. If you had an early mission or something was going on, you couldn't get that hot breakfast, then you might not get it. You may just simply have to have an MRE or go without. But from there, you're doing your missions. You're doing some kind of training, or you're doing your mission for what it is you're training up for. Now, lunch in the field is commonly just an MRE. You may have some time here and there between what you're doing to grab an MRE, scarf it down, and get back to what you have to do. And that'll usually last until maybe 5, maybe 6 o'clock in the evening. Also commonly you will have a hot dinner in the field, but again, that'll also depend on what your mission is. You may miss it, you may have to stick with an MRE, you may just not have a chance to grab that hot chow that the DFAC has set up for dinner. Now, a lot of times after dinner, your day is still not done yet. You're still doing a lot of other missions. A lot of times there are units, they want to do a lot of night missions, so you could be continuing to do mission until midnight, maybe into the next morning. It really just depends on what the training is that you were there for. Especially like with gunnery, you may have like night fire gunnery that you have to fire your Bradley, your tank, whatever you're doing gunnery for, late at night. But if you're not having to do something until the wee hours of the night, then maybe you're looking at going to bed around 9 o'clock at night, 10 o'clock at night as kind of a good area to aim for, really. But of course, these times just vary on what's happening. Now, as far as sleeping arrangements go in the field, usually you're sleeping in tents. I know when I first was in the military, you kind of started off with having it where usually the men and the women were in separate tents. Later in my Army career, it started getting a little bit more diverse, where they usually mixed the men and women, and maybe they had like some kind of blanket or something in between the men's area of the tent and the women's area of the tent. And it may not even be like that at all anymore in the Army. But you usually had like a tent that the lower enlisted were inside of, and then the non-commissioned officers usually had a separate tent. And then your higher leadership people had their own tent area, where usually like the commander and the first sergeant maybe had a tent together, maybe also with the XO or certain other leadership people. The platoon leader is usually in the tent with the non-commissioned officers though. And then at the end of the field problem, that day can usually be a really long day, really busy day, trying to recover all the equipment, tear everything down, and head back to the motor pools. So you're trying to get all your gear, all your equipment back to the motor pools. Usually along the way you're having to stop off at a wash rack to wash off the vehicles from all the dirt and everything, mud you've collected from being out in the field problem. And then back at your unit, you have to get accountability of all the weapons, the night vision goggles, any other sensitive items. And sometimes that can last for quite a while. Sometimes, you're recovering everything from the field and you're not going home until 9, 10 o'clock at night, later, sometimes earlier though. And then in some situations I've seen it where you might get a 3-day weekend, you might get a 4-day weekend, and then other situations where maybe you come out of the field on a Wednesday, you continue doing your job Thursday, Friday as recovery from the field, you just get a normal weekend and then back to normal work on Monday. That usually just depends on the leadership and maybe what kind of field problem you did, as far as if you get an extended weekend or if it's just normal day. And lastly, let's talk about the deployment life. Now currently there's not a lot of soldiers that are doing big deployments anymore, as things have winded down since like when I was in the Army. When I was in the Army, we were very active with Iraq and Afghanistan. We still have some units deploying to Afghanistan, but definitely not as large amount of numbers as previously. You don't have soldiers going to Iraq really anymore, but you do have soldiers usually going to Kuwait. But still, that's not as many people as before that were going to Iraq. And then you have other situations where units are actually doing deployments to, say, like Korea or Germany. It sounds kind of weird calling them deployments, but they're not. They're kind of just where they go with the unit. They go for maybe 6 months to Korea as a unit, instead of being like PCS or being a new permanent duty station in Korea or Germany. And then after they do their 6 months or whatever they're doing in those countries, they come back to their home station. So it sounds kind of weird calling those deployments, because I'm used to a deployment being something related to combat. But there are situations where the Army and other military branches call deployments something, where you just go as a whole with your unit to another country or another area and spend a certain amount of time there. So I can't really speak for how it's going to be for all those different situations, but I can speak for how it was for me during my 2 deployments to Iraq. So I'll give you some examples of how it was for me while I was in Iraq. During my first deployment, they weren't very big on doing PT in the mornings. A lot of times it was just get up around 6 o'clock in the morning or so, 5 o'clock in the morning, depending on what's happening during that day, and just get started with what missions we have going on. And you still have a lot of the day-to-day stuff that you would do back in the United States, like going to the motor pool and working on your vehicles and checking them out. But you would have additionally other missions, like log packs, for example. Log packs are missions where you take like food and supplies to units that are, outside of the main post. And you usually run those fairly early in the morning because you're trying to get to those locations at about 6:30 in the morning. So depending on how far you had to take your log pack could depend on how early your day was starting. Now, if you were on a main fob, you usually had a chow hall that would do breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and even in some cases they would do like a kind of like a snack time kind of lunch for those individuals who had mission during lunch, as well as midnight chow for people who had missed chow during the normal dinner times. So usually they had a lot of different variation of times for getting a hot meal from the chow hall or something, so that way if you had mission during a certain time, you could, always push your dinner until later or a little bit earlier, whatever you needed to do. Also, while in Iraq, I did a lot of night missions. A lot of times that's when we would operate. We would do a mission maybe late in the evening all the way until the next day, and then get some sleep during the remainder of the day, and then back at it later in the evening. During both of my 2 deployments, I never got weekends off. I was the whole entire time working non-stop every single day. So that got really exhausting. Your first deployment was a 12-month one, and then the second one was a 15-month one. So that 15-month one got really rough after a while. Now there was somewhere in there where you usually get a time to take leave and go back home. They have to kind of schedule it in a certain way so it's not during a set period of the deployment. You may have some individuals that go fairly early, some individuals go towards the middle of the deployment, and some individuals that have to go towards the end of the deployment. And commonly you get about 15 days of leave. Now those 15 days would start as soon as you arrive in the United States. They wouldn't count the days that you're having to spend like in Kuwait. Like you would have to go from Iraq to Kuwait, go through customs, and then get back to the United States. It started that first day that you arrived in the United States. And then you didn't have to be back in 15 days. Your last day in the United States was the 15 days, and then you may have 2-3 days of travel trying to get back to your unit in Iraq. Not everybody would take the 15 days of leave. Some soldiers wanted to simply just do like a 4 or 5 day weekend in Qatar. And from what I understand, I never did the Qatar thing, but I hear it was a lot of fun and pretty cool. So during deployments, you usually had a lot of long hours. There was a couple of days where you might have gotten a shortish day, but most of the days were long hours. A little bit of freedom that you had didn't involve getting to go off post or anything. Usually meant going to maybe if they had a PX on the post. Sometimes it was a full-blown PX. Sometimes it was just a little trailer that had some stuff in there. But for the most part, soldiers on their free time while deployed would usually watch a lot of movies. I watched a lot of movies, especially like pirated movies. You would get pirated movies on post, and you would see these pirated ones. It's usually someone filming the screen with a video camera, and that's how you kind of kept up with some of the latest movies that are coming out in the United States. Now, there are going to be some cases of different individuals have different experiences during deployments, some where they're way busier than me, some where they're even less busier than me. It's just really going to depend on what that MOS was for that individual, what their mission was, and what was happening and where they were at. So there you go. Those are several examples of some common scenarios to kind of give you an idea of the day-to-day life in the United States Army. Coming up soon, I'm going to do a video on what it's like for single soldiers in the Army as well as married soldiers in the Army. So if you like this content, make sure to go ahead and hit that thumbs up. If you want to check out some of my other videos, I got some recommended ones right over there that YouTube says are great. If you like this type of content and you want to make sure you get more of it, go ahead and hit the subscribe and maybe even hit the bell too, where you get notifications when I upload new videos. Thanks for watching. I'm ThatChrisChaos, and I will see you next time. See ya.